Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic, the podcast that breaks down the incentives that guide the decisions we make to understand who benefits from the status quo and what's at stake for the future. I'm Matt Haller.
And I'm Chris Michaud.
We're calling this episode the Pulse Check as we look back at our favorite moments of the season thus far and give our listeners a glimpse of what they can look forward to in the future. So Chris, what have been some of your favorite moments that we're going to think about on this episode?
So first, I think the loyalty conversation was super interesting, especially since there's been a lot of consternation lately about Americans' recent news that they're not going to reward miles or loyalty points anymore for travel booked via their non-preferred travel agencies. And on that note, if you think about Albert's take on what to do with points, really was fascinating and kind of parlays very well into that discussion.
Loyalty programs are losing a lot of value every day. And that's because loyalty programs are getting smarter and more complicated. They are making it more difficult to redeem your reward points. Now it's about Loyalty 3.0, which is tied to revenue in dollars. I would say the best recommendation is now you have to think in terms of seasonality. High season is going to be more expensive than low season. And so redeeming your points during peak summer, high holiday travel time, you're going to be spending more points. So if you have flexibility, you will have and gain more value out of it. If you're someone who likes to plan a year in advance, you're going to get a lot of access to great award availability. So I think before, whereas reward points were the same, now it's really going to be fluctuating based on seasonality, as we've basically seen with cash fares.
Have you been traveling a lot recently? Has this maybe been top of mind for you?
As you know, I've already flown like 35 segments this year just for work and other things. But more so, I was at dinner last night with some friends and they brought this up specifically because they travel on cruises and they buy tickets through their cruise provider. And if their cruise provider is not a preferred vendor, they're like, why would I fly American anymore? So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. It's effective May 1st. We'll see where it goes.
From my perspective, if we think back on this season, I want to first recognize how incredible our list of guests have been. I think we've been really lucky that the people who have come on to give their perspectives have been amazing. Some of the things that have really stuck out to me is if we go back to our housing conversation, I've had so many conversations with people who are trying to buy a home now and are thinking about how out of whack the real estate market is, the way that Kelly talked about.
The market right now, it's weird. And please, everybody remember that real estate is very local. But the bottom line is the market is tight with inventory. And this is causing a problem for people to buy because either they can't find what they want because there's just a shortage. It doesn't help that the interest rates are higher, than anything probably your generation has seen, of course. And buyers, they're also willing to bounce and move around a little bit more too. So they might opt for the rental route if that's what makes more sense for them. Although I will say most people aren't staying in their homes as long as they used to before. So there's a lot of movement, but also not enough inventory, strangely enough.
One of the things that I've appreciated is that when we look at these industries, we're not experts in any of this stuff, but when we look at them from an incentive perspective and say, as a human, if I try to follow the dollars and see who's incentivized to do certain things to come out on top, it tells a different story about the way that these industries work. And I think it helps our listeners unpack what the implications are for themselves.
You hit home on the housing piece. I know that was one of your favorite picks as well. I think, don't you even have a friend right now who I think is trying to buy in my hometown and has had some issues with that?
Yeah. And if I use that case specifically, and look, I'm not a housing expert, but I think there's an element of when we talk about housing, we touched on this in our episode, it's hard because it's emotional, right? It's a financial asset and we talk about it as a financial asset, but it's also a place that you have to live. We understand that right now interest rates are really high, but because the market is so out of whack and it's hard to even get into home ownership, sometimes you have to weigh, does it make sense for me to just get into the market and then try to say refinance later because at least I have the thing? It's not my decision to make. We'll see what people are incentivized to do as the market changes.
Yeah, I think another episode that came to mind to me as well was definitely the conversation with, she was my sister, but also really the state of healthcare. And her and Alden really had some great insights about collectively what we have to do to make healthcare more friendly to our wallets as well as our overall health.
We need to shift the whole way that we're seeing health in our country, but we're up against a big battle there, right? So if you take the top 3 causes of death in the United States, you've got heart disease, you've got cancer, and you have accidents, right? Number 1, heart disease. There are so many contributing factors to heart disease. And yes, some of those you cannot modify. You cannot modify your age or your underlying gender, right? The genetics of that. that. And so that's fine, but you can certainly change the way you eat, the way you move, the way you sleep. These are modifiable risk factors that if we put more time and money into prevention, my goodness, we could lower the incidence of heart disease in this country. Even just if we change the way people eat, we lower the level of diabetes, which is a direct risk factor for heart disease. And then you have the second thing, which is cancer. And who has access to the technology for screening tests? Chris, you know about this. There's this amazing blood test that screens for 53 cancers. It's incredible. It's cost almost $900 and it's not covered by insurance. And it's a simple blood test. And further on that is physicians aren't telling their patients about it because they don't want to talk about the cost of it or they just don't know about it. So we have tools to improve healthcare for sure. It's just that we're met with such opposition for getting well.
Again, going back to incentives, the incentive of that industry is just to be big. And so that explains why costs remain stubbornly inflated, because we're trying to have all of these players outcompete each other in the market. And then I think you raised this point in our episode to solve some of that. Instead of saying, how do we approach the actual problem? We said, let's just find new pockets of money to pay for the increasing prices, which actually creates more incentive to keep the prices going up. Again, places where this secret world of incentives is really showing its sometimes interesting and intriguing and beneficial head, and sometimes it's a little bit uglier.
It's unique in the sense that I can choose not to live in a house. I can choose not to buy a house. I could live in an apartment. I could choose not to go travel anywhere, or I could fly Spirit and not care about the points. When it comes to if I have a heart attack, my choices in terms of what I can choose to not do are pretty limited, right? It's either have heart surgery or die, right? So you really can't go around negotiating for heart surgery or if you have chronic care. So the whole incentive to try to figure out and navigate that is really opaque. And both the guests talked about that. And to that one, for me, just that one's probably the most elusive, I think, of the ones we've done so far.
Chris, another area that we touched on that we've heard a lot about is all the way back in our first episode around tipping. And I bring this up because I had an experience with tipping actually the other day where I was just ordering at a fast food restaurant on the way to get on the road, and somebody took my food, right? And it happens under normal circumstances. You go, you buy the new thing. But because the person took it, realized their mistake, and brought it back, I was like, well, I don't really want to touch this, and asked the people to make a new meal. No questions asked, pulled it together. And because of that, I could see like, oh God, this is going to be a really irritating situation. You throw a couple bucks in a tip jar. Now, to be fair, that's an after effect. I'm not trying to incentivize anything up front, but I watched that small act make someone's day, and watch somebody forget about the money behind it. It was the recognition that I did something for you that went above and beyond, and you rewarded me for that. That's not going to benefit me in the future, but the next time that somebody comes in and has a problem, I'm willing to bet that same employee is going to be thinking about their experience slightly different.
Well, it goes back to what Shay was talking about. It's the recognition of that, and how do you do that in a face-to-face world versus we talked about digital tipping and stuff like that. I'm glad you saw it. I had something similar, actually, of all places at the airport, where they didn't have a tip, but it was like a kind of a bespoke sort of coffee place. And I was like, oh, they did a really nice job with this latte I ordered. And I went to go give a tip and they didn't have one. And they were like, oh yeah, we don't have one. And I was like, all right, we'll just take it anyway. And she was like super excited about it. I think, again, tipping will be just like housing and healthcare and travel will be kind of everyday life things we'll have to deal with for the foreseeable future, and the new incentives behind them.
We've explored a variety of incentives up until this point.
And when we're back, we'll be previewing all that's to come. Stay with us.
Hey B2B sales pros, want to maximize your team's performance? Discover Compose Comp, your key to optimize sales incentives. We blend expertise and technology to give your reps the edge they need to close deals. Don't settle for ordinary. Visit composecomp.com and unlock your team's full potential today.
Welcome back to Fuzzy Logic. We have 4 episodes left this season that you won't want to miss.
In Loving Apps, we'll dive into the world of dating with more options, genres, and opportunities for romance than ever before, and more ways to spend money for dating choices. We're going to break down the incentives behind the dating app industry from a consumer and company point of view.
We're also going to look at the cost of convenience, where we'll unravel the fascinating interplay between the convenience and our well-being, from the digital age's impact on our rituals, routines, deliveries, and subscription services, and see if those things are truly disrupting the environments convenience they claim to be. Plus, we'll see if AI plays a role in that convenience in the future.
In Wisdom and Wealth, we'll dissect the largest transfer of wealth ever seen, a process that's really happening right now in America and around the world. Will the wealth shift be equally distributed, and how will it impact us as a whole? All things we'll decode in that conversation.
And then finally, in the community incentive, we'll wrap up the season by talking about all things community, from the idea of community, how that's evolved, and how our political incentives are getting in the way of having that community feeling. So I think ultimately, we've got a lot more to cover, Chris. We're really, really excited to bring some of these episodes to life. And hopefully, our listeners will be able to experience a better version of us after we get a little bit of rest and relaxation.
Yeah, I mean, it's love, convenience, money, and who you live and where you work as a community. So no pressure on us for the remaining of those episodes.
I have some faith in this. But while I go get ready to pack for a trip to the beach, I will let you go and read us out.
Thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of Fuzzy Logic. Fuzzy Logic is produced by Mitch Rissmiller. New episodes drop on Wednesdays wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next week.